A single hot summer could destroy an entire medieval village. Children who had survived the winter might not survive the months that followed. Families who had managed to save enough food for the year could suddenly find themselves facing starvation. Entire communities sometimes spent months watching their fields die beneath a cloudless sky. When people imagine danger in the Middle Ages, they usually think about war, disease, or harsh winters. Yet for many peasants, one of the greatest threats arrived beneath clear blue skies, a summer that was simply too hot. For medieval peasants, survival depended almost entirely on the land around them. There were no supermarkets, no refrigerated storage rooms, no national food reserves waiting to help during a crisis. A family survived because crops grew. If those crops failed, everything else began to fail as well. The arrival of summer was usually welcomed. After months of cold weather, people looked forward to warmer days. Fields became green. Animals could graze. Farmers spent long hours working outdoors. Summer was supposed to be the season of growth and abundance. But medieval peasants understood something that many modern people rarely consider. Too much heat could be just as dangerous as too much cold. A few weeks without rain might not seem like a disaster. At first, villagers simply hoped that the weather would change. They looked toward the horizon each evening, waiting for dark clouds to appear. Sometimes the clouds came, but no rain followed. Day after day, the sun continued to burn above the fields. Streams became smaller. Wells began to drop. Grass slowly turned yellow. Farmers noticed the changes long before outsiders would have. The soil became harder beneath their feet. Plants stopped growing properly. Leaves began to curl and dry. Each morning brought fresh worries. How much longer could the crops survive? For wealthy landowners, a bad harvest was an inconvenience. For peasants, it could become a death sentence. Most families lived with almost no margin for error. Their survival depended on a successful harvest every single year. There were no large savings accounts. There were no emergency food deliveries. Everything depended on what could be grown locally. As temperatures continued to rise, working in the fields became exhausting. Men and women often spent entire days beneath the sun. Sweat soaked their clothing. Water became increasingly precious. Even simple agricultural work could become dangerous. A farmer who collapsed from heat exhaustion might lose an entire day's labor. During crucial growing months, every day mattered. Meanwhile, livestock also began to suffer. Cows needed grass, sheep needed grass, goats needed grass. When drought killed the fields, animals struggled to find enough food. Farmers watched their animals grow thinner week after week. This created a terrifying chain reaction. Weak fields meant less grain meant less food. Dead grass meant hungry animals. Hungry animals meant less milk, less meat, and fewer resources for winter. Everything was connected, and medieval peasants knew exactly what was coming if the weather failed to change. The first signs of disaster had already appeared. The land was drying, the crops were weakening, and the long summer had only just begun. As the weeks passed, the fears of medieval peasants slowly became reality. The fields that had looked healthy in early summer began to change. Wheat no longer stood tall and green. Barley stopped growing properly. Oats weakened beneath the relentless heat. Farmers walked through their land each morning, searching for signs of hope. Instead, they found signs of failure. The soil beneath their feet became dry and hard. Cracks appeared across fields that only months earlier had promised a good harvest. Young plants struggled to survive. For people living in medieval villages, these changes were terrifying. Every crop represented food. Every damaged plant represented hunger. Unlike modern farmers, medieval peasants had very limited ways to protect themselves from drought. There were no advanced irrigation systems covering large areas. There were no weather forecasts warning people about what was coming. Everything depended on nature, and nature was becoming increasingly hostile. A few days without rain could be ignored. A few weeks became dangerous. A few months could destroy an entire year's food supply. The most frightening part was uncertainty. Nobody knew when rain would finally arrive. Villagers prayed, priests organized religious processions, entire communities gathered inside churches asking God for relief. But the sky often remained clear. For deeply religious medieval people, drought was more than a natural disaster. Many believed it could be a sign of divine punishment. Some wondered whether their community had committed sins that angered God. Others believed evil forces were responsible. Fear spread alongside the drought itself. Meanwhile, the crops continued to weaken. Wheat was especially important because bread formed the foundation of the medieval diet. Poor families often ate bread every single day. Without grain, survival became much harder. As harvest season approached, villagers could already see the problem. The plants were shorter, the grain heads were smaller. Many fields produced only a fraction of what they normally would. Farmers who expected enough grain to feed their families for a year suddenly realized they might only have enough for a few months. The consequences reached far beyond food. Grain also fed animals. Without enough grain, livestock became weaker. Without healthy livestock, families lost milk, cheese, meat, and valuable labor. The entire economic system of the village began to suffer. Even families that had worked hard throughout the year could do little to stop it. One hot summer could erase months of effort. A farmer could plow correctly, plant correctly, work from sunrise until sunset, and still lose everything because rain never came. As conditions worsened, water became increasingly difficult to find. Streams that normally flowed throughout summer became narrow and weak. Small ponds shrank. Some wells dropped to dangerously low levels. People often had to travel farther and farther simply to collect water. This consumed valuable time and energy. Women and children frequently spent hours carrying heavy buckets back to the village. Every drop mattered. Animals competed for the same water. Families competed for the same water. Entire communities became dependent on a few remaining sources, and those sources were not always safe. As water levels dropped, contamination became more common. Mud, waste, and animal remains could pollute drinking supplies. People who were already weakened by hunger became more vulnerable to disease. The drought was no longer just threatening food, it was beginning to threaten health as well. Still, many villagers hoped they could survive. Perhaps rain would come tomorrow. Perhaps the harvest would not be quite as bad as expected. Perhaps they could somehow endure until autumn. But as summer continued, reality became impossible to ignore. The crops were dying, the harvest would fail, and the true disaster had not even begun yet. Because a poor harvest was only the first step, the hunger that followed would be far worse. When the harvest finally arrived, many medieval families already knew what they would find. The fields confirmed their worst fears. The grain stores that should have been full remained dangerously empty. For wealthy nobles, a poor harvest was a financial problem. For peasants, it was a question of survival. The medieval world operated on a fragile balance. Most people produced only slightly more food than they needed to survive. In a good year, families might save a small reserve for winter. In a bad year, those reserves disappeared almost immediately. After a drought, many households entered autumn already worried about food, and that fear spread quickly through entire villages. The first sign of trouble often appeared at local markets. Food became more expensive, bread became more expensive, grain became more expensive. Everything that depended on successful harvests suddenly cost more. For poor peasants, even small price increases could be devastating. Many families were already living close to starvation during normal years. Now they faced a terrible choice: spend their remaining money on food, or save it and risk going hungry later. Neither option was good. As supplies became limited, some villagers tried to ration what little food they possessed. Meals became smaller, portions became smaller. People skipped meals entirely. Children often suffered first. Growing bodies required food, but food was becoming increasingly scarce. Parents sometimes gave their own portions to their children. Mothers frequently ate less so their families could survive. Fathers worked long days while consuming fewer calories than their labor demanded. The human body can endure hunger for a surprising amount of time, but eventually weakness begins to appear. People lose strength. They become tired more easily. Physical labor becomes difficult, and medieval life required enormous physical effort. Fields still needed work, animals still needed care, water still needed carrying. Yet hungry bodies struggled to perform these tasks. The situation became even worse for those who had livestock. Animals required food too. When fodder supplies ran low, families faced another painful decision: feed the animals or feed themselves. Some peasants sold their livestock before conditions became worse. Others slaughtered animals they could no longer support. This provided temporary food, but it also destroyed future security. A cow was not just meat, it provided milk. A horse provided transportation and labor. Animals represented wealth. Selling them often meant sacrificing long-term survival for short-term relief. As the months passed, more desperate solutions appeared. Villagers gathered wild plants, roots, nuts, berries. Anything edible became valuable. People searched forests and fields for food sources that would normally be ignored. Some famine foods provided little nutrition. Others could even be dangerous if prepared incorrectly. But hunger leaves few choices. A person who has not eaten properly for weeks begins to think differently. Food becomes the center of everything. Every conversation, every plan, every fear. Entire communities became obsessed with survival. The drought had ended months earlier, yet its consequences were only beginning, because now another enemy had arrived: hunger. And hunger rarely traveled alone. Soon disease would follow. Hunger weakened the body. Disease finished the job. This was one of the cruelest realities of medieval life. A drought might begin in the fields, but its deadliest consequences often appeared inside homes. As food supplies disappeared, people became weaker with each passing week. Their bodies lost the strength needed to fight infection. Minor illnesses that would normally be survivable suddenly became dangerous. Children suffered the most. They had smaller reserves of energy. They needed constant nutrition to grow, and during times of famine, they were often the first to become seriously ill. A child who survived one difficult winter might not survive a year of drought and hunger. Parents watched helplessly as their sons and daughters became thinner, faces lost color, arms became weak, energy disappeared. Many families could do little except hope. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was limited. Villagers had local healers, herbal remedies, and religious prayers, but none of these could replace proper food. Without nutrition, recovery became difficult. Without clean water, recovery became even harder. As wells shrank and streams dried, water quality often worsened. People sometimes drank from muddy ponds. Animals drank from the same sources. Waste contaminated supplies. Disease spread more easily. Diarrheal illnesses became common. Fevers spread through villages. Simple infections could become deadly. For communities already weakened by hunger, every outbreak created new fear. One sick family member could quickly become several. One household could become an entire village. Meanwhile, food shortages continued. The harvest was already gone. The grain stores were already shrinking. The next harvest was still months away. People understood exactly what this meant. They would need to survive the coming seasons with almost nothing. Some families sold tools, others sold clothing, others sold the few valuable possessions they owned. Anything that could be exchanged for food became a potential lifeline, but food itself was becoming increasingly rare. The richer members of society often suffered less. They had larger reserves, they controlled more land, they had greater access to resources. Poor peasants had no such protection. A bad year affected everyone. A famine destroyed the poor. Entire villages sometimes experienced the same tragic cycle: drought, crop failure, food shortages, disease, death. Again and again throughout medieval history. Many people today imagine famine as a sudden event. In reality, it was often a slow process. A family did not wake up one morning and discover disaster. Instead, they watched it approach for months. They saw the dying fields. They saw the shrinking harvest. They saw food prices rise. They saw their neighbors become weaker. They saw sickness spread. And every day they hoped things would somehow improve. Sometimes they did. Sometimes rain returned. Sometimes trade brought additional supplies. Sometimes communities survived, but not always. Some villages lost large portions of their population. Some families disappeared entirely. And for those who survived, the memories often remained for the rest of their lives. Because a drought was never simply about weather, it was about fear. The fear of watching food disappear, the fear of watching loved ones suffer, the fear of not knowing whether your family would survive another year. For medieval peasants, few things were more terrifying, and yet the worst droughts were capable of something even more devastating. They could change entire communities for generations. The effects of a deadly summer did not end when the drought finally broke. Even after rain returned, the damage often remained. Fields could recover, grass could grow again. But people were far more difficult to replace. A village that had lost livestock could spend years rebuilding its herds. A family that had sold its tools might struggle to farm efficiently the following season. A household that had lost parents, children, or workers could never fully recover. This is one reason why medieval peasants feared drought so deeply. The danger extended far beyond a single summer. One bad season could create problems that lasted for years. Throughout medieval Europe, periods of severe drought occasionally triggered larger regional crises. When multiple villages experienced poor harvests at the same time, food shortages became even worse. Normally, one community might purchase grain from another area, but if entire regions suffered together, there was often nowhere to turn. Prices rose rapidly, competition increased, desperation spread. People traveled farther in search of food. Some abandoned their homes entirely. Others migrated toward towns and cities, hoping to find work or assistance. Not everyone succeeded. Historical records describe periods when famine and disease worked together to devastate local populations. Although wars and epidemics often receive more attention today, environmental disasters were equally capable of causing enormous suffering. A medieval peasant understood this reality very well. The weather controlled almost every aspect of life. Too much rain could ruin crops. Too little rain could ruin crops. A harsh winter could kill animals. A brutal summer could destroy harvests. Nature constantly determined whether a family would prosper or struggle, and unlike modern societies, medieval communities had very few ways to protect themselves. There was no national emergency system, no disaster relief program, no refrigerated transportation network carrying food across countries. Most people survived only because local agriculture succeeded. When agriculture failed, everything became uncertain. This uncertainty shaped how medieval people viewed the world. Many traditions, religious practices, and community rituals reflected a deep awareness of nature's power. Villagers prayed for rain. They prayed for healthy harvests. They prayed for protection from drought. Because experience had taught them a painful lesson, human effort alone was not always enough. A hard-working farmer could still lose everything. A careful family could still face hunger. A good community could still suffer tragedy. That reality created both fear and resilience. Medieval peasants learned to adapt whenever possible. They stored food when harvests were good. They supported relatives during difficult times. They developed survival strategies passed from one generation to the next. But even the strongest communities sometimes faced disasters beyond their control. And when those disasters arrived, survival became the only goal. Looking back today, it is easy to underestimate how vulnerable medieval life truly was. Modern people can usually escape extreme weather with technology, transportation, and global trade. Medieval peasants had none of those advantages. When the sky refused to give rain, there was often nowhere to hide. And for countless families across medieval Europe, that simple fact made a hot summer one of the most dangerous events they could experience. Imagine standing in a medieval village at the end of a devastating summer. The fields are quiet. The harvest has failed. The grain stores are nearly empty. Many animals are gone. Some neighbors are gone as well. Children who played together in spring are no longer there. Families that once worked side by side now struggle simply to survive. For the people living through these events, drought was never just a weather problem. It was a threat that reached into every part of life. It determined what people ate. It determined whether animals survived. It determined whether children grew strong or weak. And in some cases, it determined who would still be alive when winter arrived. This is what makes medieval life so difficult for modern people to fully understand. Today, a hot summer is often an inconvenience. People stay indoors. They turn on fans or air conditioning. Food continues to arrive at stores. Water continues to flow from taps. Life goes on. For medieval peasants, the situation was completely different. Every season carried risks, every harvest mattered, every change in weather could influence the future of an entire family. The success or failure of a village often depended on forces nobody could control. A few weeks without rain, a few weeks of extreme heat. That was sometimes enough to begin a chain reaction leading to hunger, disease, and death. Yet, despite these dangers, medieval peasants continued to endure. Year after year, generation after generation, they planted crops, they rebuilt after disasters, they cared for their families, they adapted whenever they could. Their lives were filled with uncertainty, but they continued moving forward. That resilience is one of the most remarkable parts of medieval history, because survival was never guaranteed. Every successful harvest represented a victory. Every winter survived was an achievement. Every child who reached adulthood had overcome dangers that most modern people never experience. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. When we look back at medieval Europe, it is easy to focus on kings, castles, and great battles. But most people were not kings. Most people were ordinary peasants. Their struggles were not fought on battlefields. Their struggles were fought in fields of wheat, at village wells, inside small cottages, around nearly empty tables. The greatest enemies they faced were often hunger, disease, and the weather itself. A single hot summer could threaten everything they had built. And that is why medieval peasants feared drought so deeply. Not because it was uncomfortable, not because it was inconvenient, but because they understood exactly what might come next. The dying crops, the rising food prices, the hunger, the sickness, the graves. For countless families across medieval Europe, these were not distant possibilities, they were realities. And although centuries have passed, their story remains a powerful reminder of how fragile life once was. A reminder that for many medieval peasants, survival depended on something as simple and as unpredictable as rain falling from the sky.